Discussions of God or the nature of the divine are, well, they're contentious at best. They're sites of theological dispute lasting centuries, rifts within families, even religious wars that have swept up thousands, tens of thousands, in massacres. Of course, why should be relatively obvious. If there are God or gods, and they are often the final arbiter of truth, they're often the access to the afterlife or the standard by which life should be lived, it's of the highest possible importance to get such issues correct. Thus, the stakes around theological discussions are, well, they're inherently high. I mean, it's God. One of the means to have such conversations or even disputes is through the highly structured form of philosophical discourse. The hope there, at least, is that by applying a shared set of clear, consistent, and rigorous rules, the conversation or the dispute about the divine can at least move forward at some pace, well, at least when positions violate those shared intellectual norms, you can at least discard those kinds of ideas. So, leaning on centuries of Greek and Islamic wisdom, medieval Christians would develop just such an extraordinarily elaborate means by which to have such conversations and disputes, primarily among themselves, but sometimes they also forced Jews to do this, with the form and content of those discussions coming to be known now as scholasticism. Now, this school has gained a reputation as dry, boring, hair-splitting, and just basically detached from all reality. This is sort of the slur, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, which no scholastic ever thought to ask. It's just made up stuff. This humanist area prejudice is actually currently and thankfully being dismantled. Scholasticism is being reappreciated for its rich philosophical and theological genius, even the revolutions, positive revolutions it made in thought and discussions about the divine. One of those philosophical revolutions was inaugurated by the 13th century Scottish Franciscan John Duns Scotus. He developed a radically new manner by which to speak about the divine by claiming that the concept of being itself was univocal or univocal, such that it became possible to speak about the divine directly in terms of the worldly. A decisive break with all of his contemporaries, so much so that he was labeled as an idolater, his theology having effectively dethroned God. Indeed, it's been argued that Scotus's concept of the univocal nature of being bridged the metaphysical gap between the immanence of this world and the world of divine transcendence. Just what was Scotus's concept of being as univocal, speaking in one voice? If you're interested in magic or Hermetic philosophy, alchemy, Kabbalah, or just frankly the arcane corners of theology and philosophy, like this episode, make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica and check out my other content on topics in esotericism or esoteric philosophy, or parts of philosophy that are just esoteric. Also, if you want to support this work of providing accessible, scholarly, and free content, long-form content on topics in esotericism and philosophy here on YouTube, I'd hope you consider supporting my work over at Patreon with a one-time donation, perhaps with PayPal. You can use the Super Thanks option below the video, or you can even check out some of our merch, our Esoterica black metal-y merch. But now let's turn to what has been called a 13th century revolution in being, one that impacted everyone from Spinoza to Heidegger to Deleuze. I'm Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Medieval philosophy has an unfair and unfortunate rap as stolid, boring, and mere academic for the sake of being academic. In fact, the star of this episode, John Duns Scotus, would eventually lend his name, well, not on purpose, but to the slur dunce, That's where the word dunce comes from. It's actually short for Dunsmen, the men of Duns, the later followers of Scotus, who were taken by the emergent Renaissance humanists as just the worst kind of pedantic and rote logic choppers of their time. Thankfully, this 500-year-old prejudice is undergoing sustained reevaluation despite the damage done, the damage that you might have inherited in your opinions about medieval philosophy. For instance, in my 5 years of graduate school, when I got a PhD in philosophy, there was never once offered a single class on medieval philosophy. The prevalent idea was that was just a Catholic thing, or really just Christian theology dressed up as philosophy. It wasn't really philosophy, it was just Christianity. The truth, of course, is that medieval philosophy is an incredibly rich resource, and it's well worth your time. I'll admit, for myself, finding medieval texts, such as those by Scotus, much more intellectually interesting and much more intellectually rewarding than all of that 20th century French post-structuralist jibber-jabber, as Magister T would perhaps put it. Regardless, let this be a ringing endorsement of the philosophical production of the period, bookended basically by Anselm and Suarez. So that's really great philosophy. I hope you take the time to study some of it, and it's not just Catholic stuff. I mean, I look Catholic to you? But today, I want to turn to who is perhaps my favorite of those figures, the most subtle doctor, as he's titled, John Duns Scotus, and his development of the concept of the Univocity of Being. But to grasp why this idea is so important, frankly revolutionary, and why it was so alarming to his contemporaries, we have to rewind a good bit back to Aristotle, of course, that guy, and his reception in the Latin West. Until the translation projects of the Renaissance of the 12th century, yes, the Renaissance of the 12th century Renaissance was profoundly more decisively important for the development of European intellectual development than the later events over there in Italy. Only a tiny bit of Aristotle was known, basically the categories on interpretation and the Isagoga, a kind of Aristotle primer written by Porphyry. Even less was known of Plato, basically the Timaeus. Only later did works like the Metaphysics make their way into the Western intellectual system, very often embedded in commentaries like the absolute luminary Ibn Rushd Averroes. Now, it's impossible to understate the impact of the categories on early Latin medieval thought, because it was kind of all they had, but they did good with that one. But what is and what was up for debate is simply what that text was describing. Simply put, it's kind of a taxonomy of metaphysical, logical, and grammatical categories through which, when governed through the rules of inference given by the rules there in the prior analytics, allow one to develop valid and sound conclusions about reality, though typically through syllogistic reasoning. Now that I said metaphysical, logical, and grammatical, which is it? Those are all very different, though related, fields of philosophical inquiry. Well, it ain't clear, because Aristotle's text is frankly ambiguous. What does ta legameno mean? The thing spoken? However, what he does outline is that the subject of any inquiry is a given substance, a specific thing, potentially captured or produced really under the 9 disparate categorical genuses: quantity, quality, relatives, somewhere, sometime, being in a position, having, acting, and being acted upon. Now, to what degree these are metaphysically exhaustive, or even how Aristotle arrived at them, did he deduce these logically? None of that's clear. For my Kantian folks out there, you'll know that Kant makes a real big deal about this, a big stink about this in the first critique, and then he alleges to go on to, deduce the metaphysical categories. But one can debate Kant's deduction. But Kant's 2 deductions, actually, whatever. But for Aristotle and the scholastics, there was a deeper, outstanding issue. This episode's going to be a lot about deeper. Within any category, any given substance is selected out under that category by a more and more specific difference, which eventually serves to individuate it into matter as a substance, as a particular thing. I am the substance, Justin, of the genus human being, of the genus animal, of the genus living thing, and up and up and up to the more general and the most general categories of existence. The problem is the categories themselves are logically disparate and distinct. My somewhereness has logically nothing to do with my sometimeness. Those are logically distinct categories and they're parallel, but they don't really interact with each other. So how then could we study being as such if the very categories of being itself are logically unrelated? Well, it appears that the early Aristotle just rejected the possibility of studying being qua being as such, just for this reason. Thus, metaphysics as a science, that is, the logical study of being itself, was just impossible, and Aristotle actually laments that very fact in one of his texts, his earlier text, the Eudemian Ethics. But wait, why not just make all the other categories under another higher genus? Being itself. Anything you can do, I can do meta. This seems totally rational. Being does seem to be the most general category for, well, everything that exists in any sense of the word. But there's a problem, notes Aristotle. A genus is the product of differentiation rendered outside of that very genus. The genus of horse requires the non-horse genus of animal for it to logically and metaphysically exist. So let's try that with being. It would require a non-being genus to produce it, which seems like a setup for either an infinite recursion, you would just need being and non-being producing each other, and it's just nonsense. Non-being can't produce being. You can check out my episode on Parmenides if you want more on that insanity. Thus, being cannot be the genus to capture all the categories so as to allow for the study of being as such. Being cannot be a genus. So what is it? What is being? It's a transcendental. The transcendental. That for which all things are, but for which nothing can be said of it in itself. At least in the early Aristotle, apparently. But then Aristotle changed his mind, kinda. It turns out that not all words are expressions of a genus. Some, perhaps a great many, are actually what he refers to as pros hen homonyms. They're descriptors of a substance which occur in the various categories, but never in the same sense or in the same manner. They are ways of describing a substance shared across the categories, but through analogy rather than as differentiated by genus into lower species. This bit about analogy is going to be decisively important. Thus, a cross-categorical analysis of substance is possible not because they're part of an ultimate genus, which is being, which is nonsense, you can't do that, but because substance itself is analyzable in terms of the genus-species system of differentiation. That's how we get substances, and via analogy across the categories as pros hen homonyms. And most famously, of course, via the system of idea or causes that eventually Aristotle's going to lay out in the Metaphysics and basically argue that that really is metaphysics. Metaphysics is the study of substance via the idea, the causes. Thus, a science of being, metaphysics, is possible, but the initial object of that science is still always a given substance. And such concepts kind of entered haphazardly into the Latin West to be assimilated into Christian theology. So prior to Scotus, there were three debated modes by which to speak about the divine. Well, aside from revelation, of course, but those are matters of faith and they're not matters of philosophy. The via negativa of folks like Pseudo-Dionysius and Maimonides, who argued that no positive predicates were true of the divine, and thus only negative statements were possible. God is not ignorant. God is not evil. God is not unjust. Scotus, for himself, just rejects this position because the process of negation will either eventually lead to a positive position or it will lead to equivocation. Either the divine is beyond all predication, and as such, all attempts are ultimately equivocal, so just say that from the start, or the process of negation will, through logical disjunction, through the categories, will eventually arrive at a logical, deductible, positively predicated position. You'll get there through negation, and eventually the negation will ultimately leave you with a positive predicate. If the latter is the case, no negations are required. Just state the reality of predicate equivocation, and if the latter, Just work through the necessary disjunctions to tell us what the positive predicates are. Scotus seems to have very little patience for the via negativa, as he basically views it as a kind of unnecessarily Baroque theology, with a flair for the mystical, rather than there being any mystery there. He thinks it's just equivocation or half-baked disjunctions. Pick. An extension of this position was actually held by Henry of Ghent, about a generation prior to Scotus. Henry held that when human beings examine a given substance, a given thing, remember, they extract two senses of the being of the predicates that are true of that substance. One of them is abstract and finite and naturally determinable, the one that's actually true of that particular substance, like the wisdom of Socrates, but also one abstract, infinite, and undeterminable, one that might apply uniquely to the divine. However, because being is not a genius, which would again capture the divine, which would mean that God was just one being among other beings, with the category of being higher than God. God fits into the Venn diagram of being. This can only mean that the second category of predication, the abstract, infinite, and undeterminable, while important, cannot properly speaking be said to apply to the divine, because it's a category in being, and that's just not going to apply to God. It's just a confusion of the two concepts because they're unbounded from the original substance and kind of turned up to 11, at least in one case. The two are, in fact, equivocal. I can learn that Socrates is wise, abstract that wisdom, and infinitize it just at that wisdom, which seems appropriate to the divine. Infinite wisdom seems like the kind of thing a God would have, but for me to predicate that wisdom of God, even that infinite wisdom, would require that God be a being among beings capable of such a predication. That's not the case. It would destroy the very divinity of God. Thus, the two conceptions of wisdom are, for Henry of Ghent, fundamentally equivocal, and in our confusion, admittedly a very productive confusion because we can kind of do natural theology with it, we think one applies to Socrates and one applies to the divine. But it doesn't. Remember, you can't predicate like that because that would require God to be a being among beings. So, how does Henry then separate such similar concepts? And if all such predicates for the divine are just mere equivocates, how could we ever engage in natural theology or reasoned positions about the divine aside from faith? Or rather, how do we engage in natural theology and then know that the results of that natural theology, because of the fact that this is all equivocal, that they actually obtain? Well, because God illuminates our intellect according to Henry of Ghent, such that we're able to come to know the perfect predicates of the divine, and thus we're able to perform natural theology despite the apparent equivocal nature of the predicates. God just tells us which ones are correct somehow. Now, as you might imagine, this Illuminism, which is what this position is called, is deeply disturbed Scotus and other non-Platonically infused scholastics for a very simple reason. How do we know when we're in a state of intellectual illumination? How do you know when God is telling you, oh, that's the perfect predicate, but not that one? That's just really actually an equivocate. Why should I trust that guy's unverified personal gnosis about the perfect predicates? Indeed, Christian humility would actually seem to foreclose upon knowing that at all. I should just doubt that I'm under a divine illumination. Who am I? I'm just a sinner. And mystics may trust they've had an experience, but the non-mystics have no reason to trust the contents of those experiences. Why should I trust your illumination? Why don't you trust mine? Thus, Scotus worries that the position of Illuminationism should actually lead us to radical skepticism and thus bar the door to natural theology. Out of Christian humility, I should doubt the fact that I was illuminated, and out of just good old-fashioned, I don't trust your random illumination, I shouldn't trust your illumination either. Thus, we're just in a world where we're all skeptical of the fact that we're, through the process of illumination, we've developed what are all these alleged perfect predicates by which we do natural theology. And if that's the case, Illuminationism, ironically, should lead to skepticism. Of course, the dominant position of Scotus' day about how to talk about the divine was the orthodox Aristotelian view held by people like Thomas Aquinas. On their view, being could not be a genus for all the reasons that Aristotle had given and that we've talked about, but natural theology remained possible because of the pros hem homonyms, back in the categories. We say that Socrates is wise and that God is wise in a purely analogical sense. Thus, we protect the transcendence of the divine. Divine wisdom is infinite and not comparable to Socrates' wisdom. But qua wisdom, we can engage in non-contradictory conversation. Thus, we're not dealing with nonsense or mere equivocation, where, again, a single term can have definitions which have nothing fundamental in common. Qua wisdom, they do share that in common, but only analogously. They are analogous as wisdom, but separated by the gulf between human finitude and divine transcendence. Thus, natural theology is possible for people like Anselm or Thomas, but always as a kind of analogy. A very powerful, very rigorous analogy, but an analogy nonetheless. Scotus found this position just too weak. It's not enough to do natural theology. In fact, he argued that analogy is either just equivocity, finite wisdom and infinite wisdom really are fundamentally different, or they're not. Or analogy is actually just supposing a fundamental metaphysical unity of the two modes of wisdom as wisdom, and are therefore speaking in one voice. That the being of the concept of wisdom, finite and infinite, was univocal, one voice. Thus, no predicates properly applied to God or to anything else. Across the Aristotelian categories, predication was fundamentally equivocal and thus entailed the destruction of both philosophy and natural theology. Analogy was just equivocation. Or, such predicates had some fundamental unity, logically or metaphysically or both, such that their concept of their being was foundationally unified, and only on such grounds, argued Scotus, would natural philosophy and natural theology be saved. In fact, without it, philosophy and theology just were completely stultified. You couldn't do them. It's a positively shocking argument for the 13th century. And Scotus knew it. In fact, he openly worried that while being must be univocal for philosophy and natural theology to proceed at all, that such a commitment might actually destroy philosophy as his entire world of the time knew it. That is to say, the metaphysics of Aristotle. Why? Because it appears to commit Scotus to the idea that being is a genus, something ruled out by Aristotle, but also, for theological reasons, utterly anathema to Christian theology. Again, if you make being a genus, God simply becomes a being among other beings. Infinite and exalted and all that, but still just a being within the larger genus of being itself. God ends up inside the Venn diagram, not transcendent to it. So needless to say, Scotus is really at the knife's edge of metaphysical danger, of a metaphysical precipice. He could have forced in a wholesale gutting of the Aristotelian metaphysics, fundamentally taken for granted at that time, and he could have collapsed the modal distinction between God and everything else, a position that would not be really taken up until the arch-heretic Spinoza centuries later, where it was still fabulously controversial. Thus, it's no wonder he's been lambasted by his opponents as an idolater. And at first blush, he seems to save philosophy and natural theology by apparently robbing God of divine transcendence. And in their view, the very divinity of the divine is tossed away. Univocity was thought to dethrone God. Now, obviously, Scotus wants to avoid all of that. But how can he maintain adherence to the Aristotelian metaphysics and thus not promote being to a genus, but also not collapse the modal distance required for divine transcendence? He's not called the doctor of subtlety for nothing, folks. The dude's subtle. For Scotus, a univocal concept is one that by affirming and denying it in the same manner at the same time results in a contradiction. That should be relatively obvious, otherwise it would be equivocal. What is just to say that it's not He doesn't want to engage in like equivocal thinking. Secondly, it must be able to function as the middle term in a syllogism. This is an excellent test for an equivocal term, which is just another way of saying that the specific meaning of that term must be fixed in such a way as to avoid nonsense conclusions or, again, end up with equivocal arguments. Thus, the first step for picking out a properly equivocal concept is that logically that equivocation of that term, though through a metaphorical usage, for instance, is completely avoided. Thus, we have the first step for actually picking out our properly univocal concepts, such that logically any equivocation of terms through either metaphorical usage, for instance, is totally avoided. We have a test, contradiction and middle position in a syllogism. Now, the shift has to be to the problem of being as a genus, which again could break the entire Aristotelian system, and the preservation of divine transcendence, all the while not falling back into analogy and equivocal predication, which for Scotus were the same thing, and thus we have to preserve the real truths of philosophy and natural theology. He has to do all of that and still maintain that the concept of univocity is an idolatry. Scotus takes it that while knowledge begins in the senses, thus making him a kind of empiricist, he also takes it that the proper object of intellection is actually being itself, that for which in any metaphysical category of any kind must be primitively and transcendently true. You can only be in a vest and tie, you can only be inside a house or married or late by 10 minutes or anything else. You can only be those things if you also be. You have to be first. So to be any substance transcends all categories. But to conceive of a substance in a category, we must have the concept of being univocally applied to that substance in the state of its categories in the first place. Now, consider the divine, consider God. Simply as opposed to non-being, God must be conceived of as a being, at least provisionally. Thus, we at least have the concept of the being of God. Now, this concept of the being of God is prior to any other concepts of the divine, that is, God's infinity or goodness or wisdom or whatever. But that concept of the being of God is a necessary condition for those other concepts which are also necessarily supposedly true of God. That, again, God is good and wise and all-knowing, etc. Thus, to conceive of any being at all requires a univocal conception of being. Being functions a bit like, and I hope you Kantians out there will forgive me, a kind of logical transcendental condition for the possibility of any subject of predication. You have to have a univocal concept of being to say anything about any substance at all. But note what Scotus is not arguing. Not arguing. His position is a logical one, not a metaphysical one. Being itself isn't univocal. Not all beings be equally, especially not God, for reasons that we'll come to in a moment. What's univocal is the concept of being. Thus, this preserves our ability to reason and make logical deductions about anything that is, any substance, insofar as it is, because recall, to be truly univocal, it must also be logically and definitionally consistent. Thus is saved philosophy and natural theology. Philosophy because being is not made a genius while logic is preserved. Even analogy is actually preserved here because recall, it relies on the univocal concept of being in the first place. So that's convenient. So, hey, you Thomists out there, you can thank Scotus in the comments. Secondly, we can continue to do natural theology because the a posteriori arguments for the existence of God can jump the conceptual gap for their logical deduction. Though Scotus isn't terribly convinced of those anyhow. He doesn't really think the cosmological arguments are the argument from motion. These are the ones famously given in the Quinque Viae of Thomas Aquinas. Scotus doesn't really think that they work. Further, the Anselmian pure perfections that are the bread and butter of medieval natural theology can now, in fact, conceptually apply to the divine rather than being just mere analogues of the divine. By shifting the register here from metaphysics to logic, the univocity of being simplicator to the concept of being's univocity, Scotus is able to not only preserve philosophy, but also natural theology, but also put them on a sure logical footing, which in turn should be able to reveal proper metaphysical truths and not just provisional analogical truths. But does this move properly preserve the transcendence of the divine? Yes. Recall that Scotus refused to make being a genus, but rather move the issue of univocity from metaphysics to logic, from an ontological to a conceptual issue. Now, we can say that the concept of being is said univocally of all beings, including God, but the first pre-categorical modal instantiation of any being will either be into finite or infinite modes of being. You got to be one of those before you get categorized. This is something akin to modal intensity, to use the language of the Middle Ages. Either maximum modal intensity or something, well, less than that. Well, you can imagine what Scotus is going to do here. God is the only being of infinite modal intensity, and he gives really good arguments for that if you want to go dive into them. All pure predicates without contradiction are true of the divine. That's good old Anselm. But everything else is somehow less than this. Angels, people, the ascended master, Kimmy Gibbler, etc. And what's the modal gap between the infinite and the finite? It's infinite. Of course it is. That's the gap between the infinite and the finite. Thus, divine transcendence is preserved all the while the logical conception of the univocal nature of being sufficiently covers all beings, including the divine, thus securing philosophy and theology as true means by which sure deductive knowledge can be had, not just analogies. To Scotus's mind, he has eliminated pseudo-reasoning through analogy and equivocation. He has placed the univocity of being at its correct register of application and conceptual logic, and he's preserved the existence and rigor of philosophy and theology. This guy, all in the day's work, all in the work of a lifetime, he did this. It's breathtaking philosophy. As you might imagine, Scotus's philosophy was incredibly alarming when it first appeared. He did invert the most basic metaphysical assumptions of his day. Univocity and not analogical modes of reasoning alone could secure the possibility of philosophy and natural theology. He inverted one of the most basic assumptions of medieval philosophy. And he was clearly pushing the orthodox system of Aristotelian philosophy to its absolute breaking point. There is a razor's edge between the conceptual univocity of being and the univocity of being itself, a position that did impugn divine transcendence by making God a being among beings, or making God being itself. The dread heresy of pantheism. Something Scotus was actually accused of. Indeed, some contemporary philosophers like Deleuze, who systematically misreads philosophers for fun, has tried to paint Scotus as a kind of prefigurement of Spinoza, which is interestingly wrong. It's interesting, but it's wrong. And this is just possible, actually, mostly because of the absolute mess of Scotus's works. He died suddenly in his early 40s, and his papers were never fully edited, and even spurious works made their way into his collected works in the very famed 1639 Wadding edition. Now, you may be shocked to learn, honestly, that a complete critical edition of his works is still appearing to this day. The complete, purely philosophical works in 5 volumes, it only appeared in its fullest edition in 2006. And then, it's still mostly just in Latin. Chunks have been translated to English, but Scotus's complete philosophical works are still in Latin. Regardless, it's clear that Scotus was developing his concept of the univocity of being all throughout his lifetime, and he obviously realized how dangerous of a concept this was. It was the nuclear option of the Middle Ages, though it clearly made people on both sides of the question philosophically uncomfortable. Analogy better protected divine transcendence, and the logical aspect of his univocity of being, it better suited those people. The more radicals of the time, perhaps some of those terrifying Averroists, They wished to push his ideas further, actually insisting as close as possible to the actual univocity of being, a position that would have meant a full, complete shift, a total revolution in medieval metaphysics, one that wouldn't come until centuries later, and then, rather haltingly. But that's why Scotus and the concept of univocity of being is so decisively interesting and important. While it doesn't affect some flattening out of the great chain of being, it does provide rigorous theological and philosophical language for the process of immanentizing the divine, something key to later European occult and Hermetic thought. It's intellectually rigorous. It's not just, I saw the universe was flat, and believe me, it's an argument. It's a method by which we could come to this logically. And at least that way, Scotus and the concept of the Univocity of Being are hugely important and overlooked, not just because of anti-scholastic prejudice, but also because Scotus represents a truly subaltern position in the history of Western thought. This is truly a underground hipster metaphysics. Duns Scotus was one of the most daring, original, and challenging philosophical minds of the Middle Ages. I will die on that hill. His development of the concept of the Univocity of Being is outstanding, but of course, his notion of the formal distinction is super interesting, of the process of individuation, whereby a unique thisness, or hexeity, is the final producer of singularity, of substance itself, of a substance, along with his contributions to ethics and his proofs for the existence of God, and some of the most daring discoveries in the discussion around the philosophy of infinity in the Middle Ages, along with interesting discussions on the concept of intention. He even produces some calculus-like thinking in some of his ideas. All of this marks him out as a sadly overlooked philosopher in the history of philosophy. And if you want to encounter a bit of Scotus, the best means to do it, frankly, is through a secondary source first. I like Copplestone's second volume in the history of philosophy, before then jumping over to the great Hackett text of Scotus's philosophical writings. It's a great, logically coherent progression of his writings that includes both the Latin and the English, produced from the recent critical edition. So that's a great text. Though to be sure, Scotus is among the most difficult writers in the history of philosophy, and it is no easy task to understand him. I find myself needing to actually just read him out loud, and when my understanding of what his argument is, when it fails, I just start over to where I last understood it and start reading again. I do that over and over and over again until I think I understand him. I think I understand him, and that's no guarantee that I'm actually grasping the ideas of the most subtle doctor, Duns Scotus. Until next time, I'm Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.